Okay, hello everyone. My name is Michael Downey, Library and Information Services Coordinator at the AWRI, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar and also to welcome today's presenter, Dr. Peter Hayman. Dr. Hayman is the Principal Scientist in Climate Applications at the South Australian Research and Development Institute, or SARDI, and this position is held since 2004. With an interest in applying climate science to agriculture, Peter is with us today to discuss 6 impacts of climate change on viticulture. Now, before I go over to Peter to tell us more about today's topic, a couple of notes on what you can expect from the webinar. As usual, the format is a short PowerPoint style presentation, and this is followed by a Q&A. The session is being recorded and it will be available to view via the AWRI website. And for those that are new to webinars, it's important to remember that webinars are interactive and there are a number of ways that you can get involved. To ask a question, please type into the question section of your control panel, which is in the bottom right corner of your screen. For those with access to a microphone, there is also the option of speaking directly with our presenter by clicking the raise hand button. This is located in the top left section of your control panel. If you'd prefer to ask a question via email, please do so at infoservices@awri.com.au. Feel free to send through your questions at any time, and once we get to the Q&A, I'll get as many questions through to our presenter as possible. And just finally, for those that like to get involved through Twitter, please use the Twitter handle @_AWRI. Okay, that's enough from me now. I'm now going to hand over to Peter to get us started.
Thanks very much, Michael, and thank you for this opportunity. So climate change and viticulture, it's a topic that's been much discussed, and I've used this sort of metaphor or analogy of a sandcastle and waves at the beach. And I guess you can have an argument with a kid on the beach as to what destroyed the sandcastle. Was it the wave or the tide? And in the end, the actual, it's always a wave that will destroy the sandcastle, but on a rising tide, there are more waves. So I guess the first point is that this is about, we know we have year-to-year climate variability. Vintages are different year to year. Each vintage brings its own unique set of challenges. So that's the waves, and we know that. Underlying that, this really important question about a tide. Are we seeing a tide which is changing the frequency of these events? And for climate science, that's the challenge of detection and attribution. So these are 2 separate verbs, and it's important that they are separate, is detecting something in a time series and then attributing that to greenhouse gases and human-induced climate change. And so I guess that, and why is that important? It's important because we need to work on how we can reduce emissions, but also it's important because that gives us some indication that of future changes here. So how we detect, how we attribute, and then the really difficult aspect of projecting what those future changes might be. I guess as viticulturalists, you can also say that part of the job is to work out what are fads and what are longer-term trends. And I guess some people would say that climate change was something that was much discussed a few years ago, and it sort of dropped off a little bit. Obviously, with Paris coming up and the meetings coming up now, it's going to rise a bit. But for a while there, it just was the dominant topic. My argument is that it is still going to remain a really important factor, and we need to consider how do we think through this issue of the tides and the waves. The other part, and I'm probably guilty of overusing this metaphor, but the other part is to also say that whilst climate science has this difficult task of of how you detect and attribute. Those of us in the applications area and working in the field and as viticulturalists, we can learn from recent heat events, recent dry spells, and recent and wet conditions and so on. We can learn from those about vulnerability and resilience without really having to know exactly what the exact cause of that was. So we can go both ways there. Again, just reinforcing this point that we are talking about a global phenomenon, and this is just to, I guess, if people following this in the media, the World Meteorological Organization just yesterday announced that this year is very, very likely to beat all records and be the warmest year on record. Importantly, to beat the record, but to move us to a situation where we are 1 degree above pre-industrial. So the global temperatures have changed. If you just Google WMO and recent statements, it's really worth having a look at that. That's partly because this is an El Nino, and I guess part of that is also this notion that it's likely that next year globally could even be warmer because of such a strong El Nino. Now, interestingly, that doesn't necessarily apply to Australia because the main impact of El Nino is in our late winter, spring, early summer period rather than the following year. But across a lot of the tropical areas and so on, the impact of ENSO is into next year. And so there'll be, it's possible that will be even more so. So part of the challenge is how does what's happening globally translate down to the vineyard, and that's a difficult. I mean, we know most about global temperature and least about rainfall and extreme events at a local level. But importantly, and this graphic just stresses this point, that the two are linked, and from global tidal, using my simple analogy, the tide will change what's happening with the waves. So of course we can never say an individual heat event is due to climate change. We're never able to say that, but what we can say is that the frequency of these events is likely to. So again, I think within climate change, and this is just quick background, and certainly for viticulturalists working in this area, there's this notion of, I guess, denial and then a level of despair. And I think that as Al Gore said, both denial and despair have this in common: you don't do anything. And I think it's really important that we work on actionable knowledge from climate science. How can we use this information? And especially because viticulture is so has such a high media presence, people are really, I mean, the effect on wine quality and something people are very, very rapidly latch onto. I think it's really important that we go beyond the damage report and talk about how we can manage these things, and that's a much more interesting story than just a simple story that will all be ruined. Again, I think taking another step back, it's important to acknowledge that we have year-to-year variability and then a trend in that, but that when you have like 140-year-old Shiraz vines in the Barossa, it speaks to just the incredible resilience of the plant that we're working with. It's a very, very tough plant, and much of this time would have had no irrigation. So these are extraordinarily tough plants. Now, that's not to say that heat waves and frost and so on really make vintages incredibly difficult and affect quality and so on. But underlying this point is that viticulture is practiced in a lot of areas and under many different vintages. We're dealing with a lot of ability to adapt at the vine level, at the vineyard level, at the winery level, and across the whole sort of value chain level. So I think it's important to acknowledge that aspect. So we talk about climate change, and it's often a very generic sort of discussion. I think it's useful to break this down into these 6 factors. So the change in mean temperature, we just know that seasons will be getting warmer, and that comes from the global down to a local aspect. So the change in the mean temperature, which will be faster crop development, higher water use, and changed pest and disease aspects. Stressing that there is really high confidence in the change to mean temperature. That doesn't mean every vintage will be warm, but it does mean that over a decade we'd expect more vintages to be warm than cool. Changes to extreme maximum temperatures. So I guess how is that warming delivered in terms of extreme heat waves? And that's obviously a major concern for many in the industry. Changes to frost risk. This really interesting paradox that we would expect fewer frosts in a warming world in the long run. Firstly, I guess heat waves are going to be moving. We expect heat waves to increase faster than frost decrease, and it's possible that some of that, if we have a drying spring, these radiation frosts that we get in spring that are often so damaging could actually increase, and there's some really interesting work as the grains industry is really worried about in southern Australia, the increased risk of frost. The change to a mountain timing of rainfall influencing the soil water and disease, and how that's happening, and we'll come back to that, and then the changes to the quality and quantity of water available for irrigation, and finally the thing we're most confident in is that we're changing the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that will have aspects on the vineyard, on the vine, but also on pests and disease. So again, this is just a slide for the Barossa region, but many areas of viticulture are selected to be at the edges and well, in one sense, we're all at the edge of shifting climate and so on. So that Barossa area is between quite dry and then the cooler, wetter Adelaide Hills. But this would be true of many viticultural areas are in that situation. Now this slide of temperature and growing season temperature and suitability of different varieties will always start an argument, because people will point to something like Chardonnay being much more plastic than others and so on. But Greg Jones, who developed this, would say that this is really just looking at the European origin of these varieties and where they are, and so clearly viticulture is temperature sensitive. That doesn't mean you can't grow it outside of that range, but we would be that there are challenges in doing that. And so this is, I guess, one way to simply look at this is at the deciles, the growing season deciles in Barossa. So this is again the waves, if you like. If you use a long-term sort of record that it bounces around, we get cool vintages, like I think 2002, and then we get warm vintages, and we just have equal. If you were to say there was no change, no trend, we'd just spin that wheel of equal chance of any of them happening. What's happening is we are getting more warm. So there was 2010-11, which was a very, very cool season, and 2002, which was also a cool vintage. Interestingly, the wettest, this very, very wet vintage here, was still above average in temperature. There's work done at Nuriupa with my colleague Victor Sadras, actually warming vines and actually trying to understand this, and this has the advantage of actually working out what the impacts are in working on this now, versus just trying to compare year to year or location to location, which obviously is often very, very confounded. I guess an interesting part of this work is that, where this work is going is this notion of, can you use pruning to actually change some of the impacts so delay flowering and delay development and delay harvest, and that has interesting aspects about the fact that something like warming, which may think we just that impact can't be managed at all, it would seem that with some aspects of delayed pruning and so on, there are opportunities to adapt to that. And so they're able to raise the temperatures in that. Obviously, a big aspect of warmer temperatures is this more worrying aspect about heat waves, especially across this southern zone of Australia, where we get these very, very significant heat waves, and the real concern about them increasing and the timing of those. The actual process that the weather process that generates them is fairly well understood. And the warm air and the cold front moving across. Obviously, this is, I mean, tragically, this is what we've just experienced in the last few days in South Australia, where that cold front comes across and moves the fire. And so that this process is well understood. I guess this again highlights this point that there's both a weather component to this, and that's a forecast aspect of this, but also the inland of Australia will be warmer. And so to an extent, what the Bureau talks about with fire weather and so on is that the same conditions, the same synoptic conditions, will just give slightly higher danger. I say that's the same we're going to be looking at in viticulture, is the same synoptic conditions that come across. Now, an interesting additional question is whether climate change would change the blocking and the synoptic patterns and so on. So, and that's a key area of uncertainty. An important aspect about this is the fact that as we move the mean, the change in extremes change very dramatically. So we get more hot weather and more record hot weather. And so even if you just move a Gaussian distribution, what happens in the tails, so this is actually not changing the pattern of the distribution at all, but just moving it, you get a very big increase in the tails. This is why the insurance industry is really concerned about climate change, because those tails are what matters, and you just get these sort of extremes. And so this is the worry. Again, though, just highlighting the point that for heat waves, which do so much damage in viticulture, there's a weather component to that as well, and an interesting question, an interesting research question of just how much the actual weather systems may change, as well as the inland heating and so on. So here was just seeing that the growing season temperature has gone up, and the mean January, this is for Nurupa. All indications that now what happens is that not everything goes up exactly the same. The D there are the deciles. Just a simple point there is that if you look at growing season temperature, you would expect there would be half of them would be below decile 5 and half above decile 5. What I'm saying is what's interesting is that we're only getting 2001, 2002 and 2010 as the years below decile 5, and beyond that we're just getting these warmer vintages. And this is repeated in many other areas. If we just take that and just add warming to this, what we tend to get is that pie chart I showed before with 1 degree warmer. If you take the background, the 1960 to 1990 period, and just add 1 degree to it, half the time we're warmer than we've ever been before, and 3/4 of the time we're in this sort of in the decile 8 or higher, the last 20% of years or higher. We add 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming, we make significant changes to these. Now, an important point is that you can move around the landscape, move around a vineyard even, and get some of these changes in temperatures of 2 degrees and so on. But on an envelope of year-to-year variability and so on, these are big changes. So I guess the question of rainfall and drier future. So this is this would apply for all vineyards. This question of the sources of rainfall already water stored in the soil from winter and spring rainfall, irrigation from local dams, irrigation from groundwater, irrigation from a river. Now that's obviously not true everywhere. And the fifth one, which is really important, is also we'd add the use of recycled water. I guess an important point is that there's worrying aspects about winter-spring rainfall in southern Australia, which would have an impact across all of these. And then further, the actual water use demand goes up by about 4% per degree of warming in terms of evaporative demand. I'll come back to this point, but our confidence on what's happening with rainfall is much lower than the confidence on temperature. I think it's important that we keep acknowledging that fact, and that's also true about summer rainfall and the risk of disease in summer. So what sort of impact might this be? Water constrained future may emphasize higher water holding capacity soils. One of the interesting challenges of that in many valleys is the better and the higher water holding capacity soils are often in more frost-prone areas, and there's an interesting interaction there. This whole idea of seeking cooler mesoclimates, so finding where there are cooler parts, and also just seeking cooler areas generally. Again, a really interesting aspect about that, and highlighted by bushfire risk, is that generally as you seek cooler regions, you tend to push into bushfire risk in many ways, and that's a considerable concern of the direct impact of bushfires, but also the real worrying about smoke taint. Perceptions of iconic Barossa Shiraz, Eden Valley Riesling, and you can include many others there, may be challenged. And again, this really interesting aspect about perceptions, about does Adelaide Hills lose its cool climate sort of branding, or do people are not concerned about that? And that's what I meant about this notion of this quite interesting adaptability right up through the whole value chain, how that could work. I think an important point, and obviously anybody here knows much better than me, that there are such significant cost pressures within viticulture, with the price of grapes, and adapting to climate change can just add extra cost, which can challenge smaller enterprises, but challenge all enterprises. So extra refrigeration costs, extra harvest costs, and so on. And many of these adaptation options are come at a cost. So a principle of adaptation is that the adaptation shouldn't cost more than what you're trying to save, and that's very, very difficult if you have uncertain and low grape prices, because the question of do you use a whole lot of extra irrigations to manage some heat events when you're not too sure of the price and so on. Those are really big challenges which make this very, very difficult. This whole idea that do we shift this whole, this is an old slide of cool off in Tasmania, where you can get the and go to cooler regions, and this is Leanne Webb's work about how the whole ideal part of this, well, this mean January temperature of 23 degrees, you can quibble with whether that's where she sort of saw a sweet spot between maximum value. But just showing how that would shift south as you added warming, and so that's just I guess a simple point that, and this is ecologists would say that generally ecosystems will move poleward and uphill to deal with warming. So if you look at climate change in the past, that's tended to be the trend of what's happened. An important aspect for us in Australia is that our systems are driven very much by rainfall. So yes, viticulture is very temperature dependent, but what's happening with rainfall is a significant concern. Across the northern hemisphere, you'll see the main link to production. This isn't for viticulture, it's just for gross production. Is temperature. In the tropics, it's radiation. In Australia, it's water is often our limit. And I guess a sobering aspect about this is the fact that whilst we would expect a warmer world to be a wetter world, the worrying aspect is that there's a drying trend and a drying projection in Mediterranean regions. So if you look to an extent, that map where there's red and suggested drying, they sort of cover the world's wine regions, and that's of concern, that these mid-latitudes in these Mediterranean environments may have this amount of drying. I like this quote by Wally Broker: "The climate system's an angry beast and we're poking it with sticks." Some people would say, oh, well, because we don't know exactly what's going to happen, we shouldn't be worrying about reducing emissions, and how can we spend time on adaptation and so on. I think it's really important that we acknowledge we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how this will interact across different wine regions and so on. And that's why it's a good idea to reduce emissions, but also adaptation has to take into account and be honest about that uncertainty, especially as we talk about rainfall and so on. So there's much higher confidence in temperature than there is in rainfall. So just finishing up with these 6 main impacts: the change in mean temperature, and again reinforcing the point that there's high confidence in that. An interesting aspect is that the Bureau's forecast system with POAMA and so on will, even on a seasonal level, is likely to be getting better at being able to give us some indication on that. Changes to extreme maximum temperatures, the heat waves. I guess an important point here is that because heat waves have such a huge effect on bushfire risk and human health, that there's such a resource going into understanding, predicting these events. And so for viticulture, I'd say that it's very unlikely that we won't be warned about these events. The challenge is how do we use that information. And with Wine Australia and AWRI, we put together a fact sheet with Marty Longbottom on how to manage for some of these heat events and so on. My sense, and learning from Mike McCarthy and others, is that people have learned a lot about how to manage these heat events, and really it's about shade and water, putting on water beforehand, and managing those. But the warning for heat events is getting better and better, and the communication of that. The frost risk is a really interesting sort of paradox, that we are not seeing the same reduction in frost that we might have expected from a really simple angle, and that's partly to do with the drying in spring and partly to do with infeed of very cold polar air, this very, very dry polar air in this spring period. And there's work going on how that can be better forecast and managed. But that's something that I think is an interesting sort of counterintuitive aspect to this. The changing amount of and timing of rainfall, I guess I'm saying that the worrying aspect for Southern Australia and Western Australia is really for this drying trend in winter and spring, and that will have a major impact on the requirement for irrigation and so on. The changes to quality and quantity of water for irrigation, as you know, viticulture is very dependent on irrigation, but is very efficient user of irrigation. So that's and partly in the Murray River system, this is partly about policy risk as well, about what will be available there. It's not, many people would be well aware that there are very large plantings of almonds and other very thirsty crops, and there'll be an interesting aspect of when we do hit another drought about how that all works. Importantly, the changes to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Plants will grow differently, are growing differently from this, and that may have impacts on canopy vigor and so on, but the adaptation for that may just be pruning and so on. So that's an important aspect for viticulture, is that there are opportunities to prune and manage that. But whilst certainly if you put a leaf in a chamber, it will grow better with higher carbon dioxide, how that works across a vineyard, and also how it also means weeds will grow better. It also means that it might be that transpiration or cooling might be slightly less, and it might be that, and certainly pests and so on may change under that. So there's a lot of unknown aspects to that as well. So that's I guess a quick rundown across those factors. I think that obviously viticulture is exposed, is sensitive, but also there's a lot of adaptive capacity, and I think there's good information on all these different risks which can be incorporated. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Peter. Peter's going to stick around for a while to answer some questions, so if you have any questions, please send them through now. Just a reminder, you can type your questions into the control panel and send them through. If you prefer to chat directly with our presenter, click the raise hand button and I'll unmute your microphone And you can also email in your questions at infoservices@awri.com.au. Okay, I've just had our first question.
Okay, so it's a really interesting question. So these climate impacts are not only in Australia and are expected to be more pronounced in Europe and especially France. Have these regions and countries already seen a change in climate and weather? So the UK is now becoming renowned for sparkling wine when previously it was too cold for viticulture. So I think it's a really important point. In terms of temperature change, just simply because the Northern Hemisphere has much higher land mass, that they are seeing faster change. And the fastest change of all is in the Arctic region, which is genuinely tragic for the Inuit people. But for Germany and those regions and so on, there's some really fascinating changes, and some of you people may be much more aware of than I. But the actual rate of change there in temperature and so on is very, very high, and that's having all sorts of impacts on ecosystems and so on there. So I think that's a really interesting aspect, how that will change. In terms of England, yes, England's getting warmer. A really interesting aspect for England is obviously the ocean currents as well. And so again, because England, for its latitude, is much warmer than it should be. So yes, there's a bit of warming on top of that. I guess in the longer term, there's some questions about how that would change. So I guess I'd say that the confidence about big land masses warming more is very, very high. That how in the long term places like England change with difference in currents and so on, there are some interesting questions about that. I think obviously, and you as people involved in viticulture are really aware that it's an international industry. And there'll be benefits and costs of warming all around. One of the interesting aspects when we were talking to some people in Tasmania is this interesting question of when things do warm and you have more confidence to grow some longer season varieties. I mean, let's take a step back. It's really interesting that in, I think, 2003 or 2002, Di Davison did a report on the Adelaide Hills for climate in the Adelaide Hills, and as far as I can see reading that report, the main problem was that you couldn't ripen many red varieties in the Adelaide Hills. So Adelaide Hills being too cold to do that. So obviously there are benefits from warming in all regions, and there's going to be costs and benefits in this. One of the challenges is that if you do accept a warming trend, then the cold season in your warming trend becomes your enemy. So in Tasmania, if you start planting varieties that are going to benefit from some warming, so it goes back to the simple analogy of tides and waves, is that the suddenly a few cool vintages become a real challenge in that situation and so on. But I think that's true. Australia, I guess, there's much of our viticulture is at the warmer edge. We are very water dependent, and there are other areas like Chile and so on that have abundant water and so on. So there are some real relative concerns there. The other thing that people have said to me from Europe, and you'd probably have more knowledge of this, is that because of the very, very strict rules about regions and so on, so Hans Schultz has sort of said that Europe's like in a cage where the adaptive capacity to actually move and shift and so on becomes quite a challenge under those conditions.
Okay, thanks very much for your question there, Warren. If you have any follow-ups, please send it through now. We don't have any further questions at this stage, but we will stay on the line for another 30 seconds or so and just see if we do get any final questions. Otherwise, we'll begin to finish. Okay, we've got a question here from Leon, but I'm just not quite sure what you're asking there, Leon. Perhaps try sending it through again. Leon, I've just unmuted your microphone. Can you hear me over there? Hello, Leon? No. Okay, looks like that's going to be it with regard to the Q&A. Leon, if you do have a question, you can send it through or reply to the email that I'll send you later today, and I'll forward your question through to Peter. Okay, I firstly just like to thank Dr. Hayman for presenting and coming in today. Also like to thank everyone who's attended and took part in today's session. For attendees, you'll receive a follow-up email. This email will contain a link to this recording and will also contain a link to a survey. Should you need to follow up on anything, please feel free to contact the AWRI directly, and if need be, I can put you in contact with Dr. Hayman. Next week's webinar will be presented by Neil Scrimger, a senior scientist at the AWRI, and the topic is using inline sensors to monitor sugar levels during fermentation. If you haven't already registered for this session and would like to do so, please visit the AWRI website. And once again, thank you to everyone for joining, and please do check out the AWRI's webinar program to register for future sessions.